My role as a father. I'm a new father, and I take my duties and my responsibilities to my family very seriously.
Under the gilded ceilings of the royal palace, where history and tradition have reigned for centuries, a shocking betrayal unfolded. The priceless royal jewels, symbols of power and heritage, were vanishing, one piece at a time. But the unthinkable revelation?
Because it was false. Must include the adorable jewels.
The very person entrusted with safeguarding them, Queen Camilla. What began as quiet whispers spiraled into an explosive scandal, forcing Prince William into a heart-wrenching decision that would shake the monarchy to its core.
Many Canadians are feeling anxious about the drastically changing world.
This is the untold story of trust broken, loyalty shattered, and a crown forever changed. It all started when a few palace aides noticed something unusual during a routine inventory of the royal collection. Some of the royal jewels, those irreplaceable heirlooms that had been passed down through generations, were nowhere to be found. At first, it was a single piece, but as time went on, the list of missing items grew. These jewels were far from ordinary. Each one told a story, carrying the weight of centuries of history. There were pieces worn during state occasions, coronations, and royal milestones, gifts from foreign dignitaries, priceless items that carried not only monetary value, but symbolic significance. They had always been kept under tight security, each one carefully cataloged and closely guarded. But as more items went missing, the palace staff began to grow uneasy. The initial explanation, provided by the senior curator, seemed reasonable at first. Some of the missing items, they said, were simply on loan for restoration or exhibitions. The palace vaults housed thousands of pieces, and it wasn't unusual for certain items to be temporarily moved. A diamond tiara or a rare brooch being sent away for a few weeks seemed plausible. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the disappearances could no longer be dismissed as simple loan agreements or restoration efforts. More and more pieces, once thought to be secure, vanished without explanation. One of the missing items was a sapphire brooch, a piece worn by Queen Victoria during a significant anniversary. It was a symbol of the monarchy's deep-rooted history, and its absence raised questions. A pearl choker, famously gifted to Princess Diana by a Middle Eastern ruler, was another precious piece that couldn't be accounted for. Even an ornate diamond-encrusted snuff box, a relic from the Georgian era, had disappeared. These were just a few of the pieces. As each new item was added to the list, staff members couldn't help but wonder, was something more serious at play? The staff began to exchange uneasy glances, and a sense of distrust slowly crept into the palace. No one dared speak the word theft outright, but it loomed in the air like an unspoken truth. The royal vaults had always been considered impregnable, guarded by not just alarms and steel barriers, but by an unshakable code of loyalty. To think that someone within the royal family or the household staff could be responsible was inconceivable. The very idea threatened to tear at the fabric of royal tradition. But the evidence, or rather the absence of evidence, was becoming harder to ignore. While the palace staff continued to carry out their duties, their conversations had shifted. The royal jewels were no longer a topic of casual discussion. Instead, they were whispered about in hushed tones in the corridors as the unease in the palace grew. It was a comment at a private charity event that would change everything. A well-connected art dealer from Geneva, speaking casually over champagne, mentioned a rare royal-style tiara that had appeared in a discreet auction in Monaco. According to the dealer, a private collector had purchased the tiara, but its design was almost identical to one believed to still be in the Queen Mother's collection. The dealer had laughed it off, suggesting that it was just an exceptionally convincing imitation. But those who overheard the conversation couldn't shake the implication. The royal jewels were vanishing, and they were turning up in private auctions, far from the palace's secure vaults. In the face of these mounting concerns, Prince William knew that the issue could no longer be ignored. The missing jewels were not just valuable, they were irreplaceable. They represented the monarchy's history, and if something was happening to them, it could not be swept under the rug. He ordered his aides to begin a quiet investigation. They started to cross-check the royal collection's records, comparing old photographs of the jewels to the current inventory. The deeper they looked, the more discrepancies appeared. It wasn't just that pieces had gone missing. There was a troubling pattern. Certain items, which should have been seen at state banquets and public events, had not been on display in years. Official explanations for their absence grew thinner with each passing day. However, even though the suspicion was rising, no one dared bring the matter to Prince William without solid proof. The last thing the monarchy needed was a public scandal, especially one that could cast doubt on the integrity of the royal family. But despite everyone's best efforts to avoid it, the rumors refused to fade. They lingered in the air like a question no one wanted to answer aloud. The unease in the palace was palpable. Staff members began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes in the way things were done. There was a tightening of security around the royal vaults, but even that couldn't shake the growing sense of distrust. It wasn't just the missing jewels, it was the silence that followed. For those who worked at the palace, it felt like the very foundation of their world was beginning to crack. The royal jewels, once symbols of continuity and unbroken tradition, had become the center of an unsettling mystery. But it was clear that no one person could uncover the truth alone. The situation called for someone outside the usual palace channels, someone with the skills to investigate without raising suspicion. That's when Prince William made his decision. He needed someone who could work discreetly, someone who could follow the trail without drawing attention. After careful consideration, he turned to Simon Harcourt, a former intelligence officer who had transitioned into private security consulting. Harcourt was a man who understood the stakes. He had worked on sensitive assignments for the royal family in the past, and his discretion was beyond question. He knew how to get things done quietly, without anyone in the press catching wind of it. For Harcourt, this was more than just a job. It was about safeguarding the royal family's legacy, about protecting the monarchy from scandal and embarrassment. The investigation that would follow would take months to unfold. It was slow, meticulous work, often hinging on tiny details, like the cut of a gemstone or the engravings on a clasp. But each step brought Harcourt closer to the truth. The missing jewels were not just disappearing at random. They were being moved with intention. Whoever was behind this knew the value of the jewels and how to conceal their movements. It was at this point that Harcourt began to realize the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a case of missing items. It was a case of betrayal. And as he dug deeper, the path began to lead him closer to the heart of the royal family than anyone had ever expected. But at that early stage, no one could have predicted how far the investigation would go or what it would ultimately reveal. The royal jewels were not just symbols of wealth or power. They were symbols of the monarchy's very existence, and the mystery surrounding their disappearance threatened to unravel everything. As the investigation continued, one question remained at the forefront. Who was behind the thefts? And what was the true motive for taking these priceless pieces? It was a question that would soon lead Harcourt and Prince William down a path they never could have anticipated. As the whispers of missing royal jewels began to grow louder within the palace, Prince William realized that it was no longer enough to rely on the palace's standard explanations. The jewels had been disappearing for months, and official statements from the curators and staff were growing increasingly thin. The stakes had grown higher, and a deeper investigation was necessary, one that would move outside the palace's usual channels, where secrecy and discretion were paramount. The royal family, by its very nature, thrived on trust and loyalty, especially when it came to its treasures. The idea of a betrayal within the royal household was unthinkable. For years, the royal jewels had been handled with the utmost care, each piece carefully catalogued, each transaction recorded. To imagine that something could be amiss was a jarring thought. But as the days went by, it was becoming undeniable. Something had gone wrong. Prince William, knowing the importance of discretion, made a decisive choice. He reached out to Simon Harcourt, a former intelligence officer with a long history of working with sensitive assignments. Harcourt had transitioned into private security consulting after leaving the intelligence services, and he was known for his quiet, efficient work. More importantly, he understood the complexities of royal protocol. He knew that uncovering the truth would require a delicate balance of thorough investigation and absolute discretion. When Harcourt arrived at Kensington Palace, the air was thick with unease. The very nature of the task at hand meant that no one within the palace could know the full extent of the investigation. The palace staff, from the curators to the senior aides, had been under suspicion, but no one could risk publicly accusing anyone without solid proof. That meant that everything had to be done quietly, out of sight of the press and the public eye. If word got out, the scandal could escalate beyond anyone's control. Their first task was to gather all available records of the royal jewels, inventory lists, photographs, past transaction logs, and anything that could provide insight into where the missing items had gone. It was painstaking work, but the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. Harcourt, along with a small team of trusted aides, cross-referenced every available document, comparing it to old photographs of the jewels. Each discrepancy pointed to the same conclusion. The jewels were not simply misplaced or lost. They were being moved. Someone or some group was orchestrating the disappearances. As the investigation continued, the scope of the situation expanded. It wasn't just one or two missing pieces. Harcourt uncovered an entire network of transactions that involved royal jewels being sold through discreet private auctions. These auctions were not the public affairs one might expect, with media coverage and royal approval. Instead, these sales were carried out under the radar, using intermediaries who ensured that the transactions were kept as quiet as possible. It was a challenge for Harcourt to trace the path of these missing jewels, but the key lay in the details. Certain pieces had been unmistakably linked to royal events, heirlooms that had been worn at state banquets, coronations, and other major occasions. There were photographs, old records, and descriptions that made it clear the missing jewels were irreplaceable. Yet, the question remained: who had the means and the access to move such valuable items without being noticed? The breakthrough came when Harcourt identified a recurring name in the auction records: Charles Everley. Everley had once been a senior aide to the royal family, a figure who had been trusted with the movement and care of royal items for exhibitions and public viewings. He had left palace service under murky circumstances 3 years earlier, but his name kept appearing in connection with auctions where royal jewels had been sold. Everley had always been known for his connections in the luxury market, especially in Europe, and his expertise in rare and valuable items had made him an ideal candidate for those seeking to acquire high-end pieces. Harcourt's team began to dig deeper into Everley's background. They found that after his departure from the royal household, he had opened a consultancy business that specialized in sourcing rare, historically significant items for private collectors. Everley had positioned himself at the center of a network that catered to the elite of Europe's luxury market, and he had the connections to facilitate the sale of the royal jewels without raising suspicion. The investigation took a pivotal turn when Harcourt discovered that Everley had been acting as a facilitator in several of these auctions. While he was not the direct seller of the jewels, he had introduced buyers to auction houses and private brokers. He had ensured that transactions were carried out smoothly, without a trace of the jewels' true origins. In essence, Everley had become a middleman, connecting the royal jewels to the private collectors willing to pay top dollar for them. At this point, Harcourt knew that the investigation had to move quickly. He could not let this go on indefinitely without confronting the central figures involved. But there was a crucial question still hanging in the air. Who was Everley working with? Who was the ultimate benefactor of these royal jewels? It was one thing to uncover Everley's role in the transactions, but it was quite another to determine who had orchestrated the entire scheme. The investigation soon turned its focus to the travel records of Charles Everley. As a former royal aide, Everly had extensive knowledge of the royal family's schedules and travel plans. He knew when the royals would be abroad for state visits or exhibitions, and he knew which pieces of jewelry were in circulation at any given time. But it wasn't just Everly's travels that were under scrutiny. It was the names of those who had accompanied him on certain trips. It was here that a new lead emerged. Harcourt discovered that Everly had traveled frequently with a woman whose identity was concealed under diplomatic clearance. The records were sparse, but with further investigation, Harcourt was able to identify her as none other than Queen Camilla. The realization hit Harcourt like a bolt from the blue. Camilla, as queen consort, had access to the royal vaults and could move freely within the palace. She had the authority to approve loans for exhibitions or private viewings, and as a member of the royal family, she could justify taking certain pieces of jewelry without raising suspicion. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and Harcourt knew that he had uncovered something far more serious than he had anticipated. The investigation had moved from being a simple case of missing jewels to something much more explosive. It appeared that Camilla, who held a prominent public role, had been directly involved in the movement of these irreplaceable heirlooms. But was she simply a facilitator? Or was she the mastermind behind the operation? That was the question Harcourt was now determined to answer. With this new information in hand, Harcourt took his findings to Prince William. It was time to confront the reality of the situation. The palace, which had once been a symbol of unbroken tradition and security, was now at the center of a scandal that could tear it apart. The jewels were not just missing. They had been sold, and the trail was leading straight to the heart of the royal family. But as William read through the reports, his mind raced. He had known from the beginning that the matter was serious, but the extent of the betrayal was almost too much to comprehend. Queen Camilla, a trusted member of the royal family, was implicated in the theft of royal treasures, and now the investigation was about to take a dangerous turn. The question of loyalty, of duty, had been called into question. The investigation into the royal jewels had become far more than a search for missing objects. It had become a battle for the very soul of the monarchy itself. As the investigation continued to unfold, Simon Harcourt's findings began to lead him down a path that was both surprising and unsettling. What had once seemed like a string of isolated incidents now appeared to be part of a larger, more calculated operation. Harcourt had uncovered crucial details about Charles Everly's involvement, but it was the revelation that Queen Camilla was also connected to the missing royal jewels that truly shocked those who were part of the investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the question of who was at the center of it all remained unanswered. Harcourt knew that confronting the facts was no longer a matter of simply collecting evidence. The stakes had been raised to a point where the truth could no longer be ignored. Prince William had been kept informed throughout the investigation, but as the details came to light, the situation became increasingly delicate. This was no longer just a case of stolen property. It was a breach of trust at the highest level of the royal family. If the allegations were true, it would shake the monarchy to its very core. The information that Harcourt had gathered was damning. The more he delved into the records and connections, the more it became clear that the royal jewels had been systematically moved through a network of private auctions and luxury brokers, each transaction carefully arranged to keep the sale of these priceless items hidden from the public eye. But what was truly disturbing was the involvement of Queen Camilla. For years, Camilla had been a respected member of the royal family. As queen consort, she had the authority to access the royal vaults and oversee the handling of royal treasures. She had always maintained a public image of grace and poise, representing the monarchy at official functions and charity events. To think that someone in her position could be involved in such a scandal was almost inconceivable. But the evidence was clear. Queen Camilla had been traveling frequently with Charles Everly, the very man at the center of the operation, and had even accompanied him on trips to private auctions in Monaco, Geneva, and Paris. The travel records were irrefutable. The pieces that had been missing from the palace were turning up in foreign collections, and each time, the trail seemed to lead back to her. The The more Harcourt pieced together, the clearer it became that Camilla was not just a passive participant in this operation. She had the knowledge, the access, and the authority to facilitate the movement of these jewels. It was no longer a matter of suspicion. The involvement of someone so high-ranking within the royal family made the situation even more dire. If the accusations were true, the monarchy would be faced with a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Harcourt's next step was to verify every detail before presenting his findings to Prince William. There could be no room for error. As Harcourt cross-referenced travel logs, auction house records, and photographs, he began to see a pattern. The missing jewels were being moved through a series of intermediaries, each one ensuring that the transactions were carried out discreetly. The brokers involved were skilled at hiding the true origin of the pieces, often using vague descriptions in auction listings to avoid raising suspicion. But as Harcourt examined the auction records more closely, he found that many of these sales had taken place under circumstances that were too controlled to be a mere coincidence. The buyers were high-profile collectors, the kind of people who could afford to pay millions for a piece of history, but who also understood the need for discretion. Harcourt knew that he was getting closer to uncovering the full scope of the operation. But with each new lead, the risks grew. The royal family had long operated under a veil of secrecy, and the idea that a member of the family could be involved in such a scandal was not only shocking, but dangerous. If the truth were exposed, the monarchy could face a public relations disaster that would take years to recover from. But Harcourt was determined to see the investigation through. He understood the stakes. This wasn't just about missing jewels. It was about the integrity of the entire institution. As the days passed, Harcourt's investigation began to lead him to a more disturbing conclusion. Queen Camilla was not just involved in the theft of the jewels, but she had been actively participating in the scheme. The travel logs showed that she had accompanied Everly on multiple trips, often to locations where royal jewels had been sold in private auctions. There were even reports from auction house staff who recalled her involvement in the transactions. One particularly troubling report came from a Parisian auction house, where a member of the staff described how Camila had personally delivered a velvet box containing a sapphire and diamond brooch. The brooch was later identified as one that had been part of the royal collection, missing for almost 2 years. The evidence was mounting, and Harcourt knew that it was time to bring his findings to Prince William. The younger prince had been briefed on the investigation, but had not yet seen the full scope of the situation. Harcourt understood that this would not be an easy conversation. The future of the monarchy was at stake, and the involvement of a member of the royal family, especially someone as high-profile as Queen Camila, made the situation incredibly sensitive. When Harcourt finally presented his findings to Prince William, it was in a private meeting held away from the usual royal offices. They sat in a quiet study, surrounded by maps and books of history. Harcourt laid out the evidence piece by piece, showing William the travel logs, auction records, and photographs that linked Camilla to the missing jewels. It was a painstaking process, but William listened carefully, his face expressionless as he absorbed the information. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of what was being revealed. As Harcourt finished his presentation, he looked at William, who sat back in his chair, deep in thought. The younger prince had always been seen as a figure of strength and responsibility, but now he was faced with a decision that could change the course of history. The evidence against Camilla was undeniable, but how could he move forward? The royal family had always been about unity, about presenting a united front to the world. To accuse a member of the royal family, especially someone as respected as Camilla, was a decision that could tear apart everything the monarchy had worked to build. Prince William knew that this was not just a family matter. The monarchy's reputation was on the line. If the truth were to come out, it would not just be a scandal. It would be a crisis. The jewels were not just valuable possessions. They were symbols of the monarchy's history and continuity. To see them sold off to private collectors would be to erase a part of the royal family's legacy. And if the accusations against Camilla were true, it would shake the very foundation of the institution. William's mind raced as he considered his next move. He had always been prepared for the challenges of being a future monarch, but nothing had prepared him for a betrayal of this magnitude. The decision he was about to make would not only affect his family, it would affect the future of the monarchy itself. The room fell into a heavy silence as William thought through the implications of the investigation. His next steps would not be easy, but he knew that they had to be decisive. The royal family had always stood for something greater than individual interests, and if one of their own had betrayed that trust, then it was his duty to protect the institution. The investigation had gone further than anyone had expected, and now it was time for Prince William to take control of the situation. The decision to confront Queen Camilla was not one that Prince William made lightly. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, but the consequences of taking action were just as clear. The monarchy had always been built on a foundation of trust, both within the royal family and with the people of the United Kingdom. To accuse a member of the royal family, especially the Queen Consort, of such a severe betrayal was an unprecedented step. Prince William understood that whatever happened next would change the course of history for the monarchy. For days, he carried the dossier containing the full scope of the investigation, the details of the missing jewels, the connections to private auctions, and the undeniable links to Queen Camila all weighed heavily on his mind. The more he reviewed the evidence, the clearer it became. This was not a matter that could be ignored or swept under the rug. The royal family's legacy was at stake, and Prince William knew that he could not allow the trust of the people to be compromised. Yet, the confrontation was not something he could approach recklessly. The stakes were too high. He had to be careful, deliberate, and precise in how he approached Camila. His first instinct was to act quickly, but as the days passed, he realized that he needed to take the time to consider every possible outcome. The monarchy and its ability to maintain the support of the public depended on how he handled this situation. As the day of the confrontation approached, Prince William chose the setting carefully. He decided to meet with Queen Camilla in the Blue Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace, a space that was both formal and private. The room had seen its fair share of royal discussions, and it was here that William would make his decision. It was a room where difficult conversations were had, but also one where decisions were made that could shape the future of the monarchy. The heavy drapes were drawn, and the air in the room felt still as William waited for Camilla to arrive. When she entered, she was composed, as always. Camilla's grace and poise had always been a defining feature of her public image. She carried herself with a calm confidence that had made her a beloved figure within the royal family. But today, something was different. There was an unspoken tension in the air, and William could feel it the moment she took a seat across from him. The smile she wore was polite, but it was guarded, as if she already sensed the gravity of the conversation that was about to unfold. Without ceremony, Prince William slid the dossier across the table to her. He didn't need to say much. The evidence was clear, and he knew that once she saw it, there would be no turning back. Camilla's eyes flicked briefly to the cover, but she did not immediately open it. She looked up at William, her gaze steady, but there was something unreadable in her eyes. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice even, though there was a slight edge of curiosity in it. William's response was measured, calm. He explained the findings of the investigation, detailing the missing jewels, the auction records, and the trips Camilla had taken with Charles Everley. He spoke of the testimony from auction house staff and the connections that had been uncovered. With each piece of evidence, Camilla's expression remained impassive, but William could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. It was not fear or surprise, but something else, a recognition that the conversation was heading in a direction she could not deny. As William continued, he pressed her for answers. Why had certain heirlooms not been seen in years? Why had the official records been so vague? Camilla countered with explanations that were becoming less convincing with each passing moment. She claimed that pieces of jewelry were often moved quietly for restoration, or discreetly loaned for diplomatic purposes. She insisted that no one outside the palace understood the intricacies of the royal collection, and that the work of maintaining the jewels often required a level of discretion. But William was not convinced. The more she spoke, the more her words rang hollow. The evidence from the investigation was too compelling, too clear to be explained away by vague excuses. Camilla's defenses grew weaker, and William knew that she understood exactly what was at stake. The conversation grew tense, with both parties struggling to maintain control. Camilla's tone sharpened as she accused William of being swayed by palace gossip, of allowing ambitious advisors to cloud his judgment. She implied that he was overreacting, that the investigation was being blown out of proportion. But William pressed on, reminding her of the responsibility they all carried to safeguard the monarchy's legacy. It was not just about jewels, it was about trust, loyalty, and the image of the crown itself. The meeting ended without a confession. Camila rose first, smoothing her jacket as she prepared to leave. Her posture remained perfect, as though the confrontation had not affected her at all. But there was something in her silence, in the way she avoided William's gaze, that spoke volumes. The balance between them had shifted, and there would be no return to the quiet civility that had once defined their relationship. As Camilla left the room, Prince William remained seated, staring at the closed door. The weight of the decision ahead was crushing. He had hoped for a different outcome, but now he knew that there was no going back. The evidence was irrefutable, and the betrayal was too significant to ignore. William understood that the next steps would be just as difficult, but they could no longer be avoided. The following days were marked by a sense of unease within the palace. The tension that had hung in the air during the confrontation lingered. There were subtle changes in the behavior of the staff, who moved with a kind of strained politeness. Conversations were clipped, and there was a noticeable absence of Camila from certain royal engagements. The public had not yet been informed of the situation, but those within the palace could feel the shift. The balance of power had been altered, and the royal family was on the brink of a crisis. Prince William, too, moved with quiet resolve. He understood that the decision he would soon make could not be delayed much longer. The monarchy's reputation hung in the balance, and the consequences of hesitation were clear. The press had already begun to speculate about the situation, with rumors swirling about the sudden absence of Camila from public events. The press officers worked tirelessly to deflect attention, but the truth could no longer be contained. In the days that followed, Prince William met with his closest advisors, discussing the next steps. The decision was clear. It was time to make a public statement. The monarchy's legacy could not be left in limbo. A decision had to be made, and it had to be decisive. The crown's authority could not be compromised, and if Camila had betrayed that trust, then action had to be taken. The morning William decided to act was overcast, a sign of the storm that was to come. He had spent the previous evening reviewing his options, going over every detail of the situation. By mid-morning, the statement was finalized. It was a rare move for the royal family, but William knew that it was necessary. The monarchy's duty to preserve its heritage and protect its legacy was paramount. As he entered the press room, the journalists fell silent. Cameras flashed and pens poised. The room was tense with anticipation. William stood at the lectern, his hands resting on the prepared text. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it as he spoke. He announced that, effective immediately, Camila would no longer hold the title of Queen Consort. Her royal duties would be reassigned, and her public role within the family would cease. The decision was a painful one, but it was made in the interest of safeguarding the monarchy's integrity. The shockwaves from the announcement were immediate. Within hours, the news was all over the media, sparking a flurry of reactions. Some expressed support for William's decision, praising his courage in holding even his own family members accountable. Others criticized the move, arguing that it risked further fracturing the royal family. The press conferences were filled with questions about the missing jewels, but William remained tight-lipped. The decision had been made, and now the monarchy would have to face the fallout.